Hello everyone and welcome to Smack Talk. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I've been playing a lot of Marvel Snap. I got addicted to Marvel Snap probably 2-3 years ago. I forget when it officially came out, but I was involved with the beta before the official release of the app. So I got a lot of extra time on it, but I did take a hiatus about a year ago and then I've recently gotten back on it over the summer. And I finally reached a personal goal of being what I would like to think is like the top 1%. I'm going to guess there's about 200,000 players, if not more, and I'm dabbling around the top 2,000. I've had a lot of opinions on this game, and I finally feel like maybe I'm justified in being on my high horse and finally able to talk about some of these. And also, if I'm correct and this does make everyone a better player, that's fine with me because I've sort of reached some of my goals with this game. So I'm thinking about maybe making this multiple parts, but today I really wanted to talk about what I think the actual stat lines are for certain cards. For example, if you've watched any sort of Marvel Snap content before, you've probably heard that a 3 cost should give you at least 5 power. Like a 3/5 is a good stat line. But I disagree. I think a 3 cost is actually a 7 is what it should be giving you. A 3/7 is the ideal. And you might be thinking to yourself, very few cards are able to do that. That's a bad thing to want in a 3 cost card. And that's where I say there's actually a little bit of a formula that I have in my mind that I've been using when I play Snap to sort of dictate if a card is good. This also helps me figure out if I want to spend tokens to get a certain new release card as well. Basic breakdown of my formula, I'm first going to be looking at the ideal power of a card. I say ideal power because we can't just trust what's on the orange hexagon on top. Black Panther is probably one of the better examples. It says 4 on the top, but obviously once you reveal it, it becomes an 8. And usually we're comboing that and trying to get it to at least a 16. So Black Panther's ideal power is 16, not 4. Then the next thing I want to look at, especially when we're talking about cards that give you lots of power, obviously it's a huge perk if it's also disrupting your opponent somehow. So if it disrupts in any way, I'm going to go ahead and give it an extra 2 points. Sometimes I'll take away 2 points from this total score if it's disrupting you somehow. Think cards like Ebony Maw, where you either have to do a lot to cheat it out, or if you just play it normally, you lose access to a location. Next up, I'm going to subtract any sort of RNG element in the card. So if anything can be sort of randomized about it, I'm going to take away whatever its cost value is. So think cards like the newly released Cersei. Cersei changes all of your cards to a higher level card. In theory, that sounds good, but it could also turn out bad. And it's sort of bad to take a risk like that on a 5 cost. There's just a lot of other things we could be doing, so we need to account for that in our formula. Last thing would be deducting subtraction-wise is turns needed. Let's go back to sort of that Black Panther Shuri example. Shuri should, in theory, get the power that it's creating attached to its cost, right? It's creating 8 power on top of Black Panther, so really it's a 4/9, but it takes 2 turns to create that 9 extra power. And so I want to take account into any times where cards need multiple turns to really get that power. And then finally, I'm going to multiply a negative if the cards that it needs to get those power are all high cost. So Shuri, for example, is foreshadowing a sort of bad card to me because you also typically have to play a 5 cost on top of it next turn. And so you're sort of wasting what variability you could do. In theory, if you could do like a Shuri and then like a high 2 cost card and then also a 3 cost somewhere else, now that Shuri is having more variability and it's a better card as a whole, but typically that's not how we see it or use it, and so I'm keeping that as a part of the formula for now. That Shuri just requires that handicap and is therefore maybe not as good as we think. So on the right, you'll see the goal as well. The goal will say what the stat line should be. A 1 cost should be 3, a 2 cost should be 5, a 3 cost should be 7, a 4 cost should be 9, a 5 cost should be 11, and a 6 cost should be 13. That's what we should be hoping for. And then I'll put the actual score of the card onto the right. And I'm just going to be showing sort of my Excel sheet of the formulas as I was doing for these cards. Hey, this is Future Austin. I decided to go ahead and include some input on RSM real quick. I got it today. I unlocked it with 2 keys and have been playing with it for about 2 hours, and it's surprisingly good. I think this is a really good card. I originally wasn't going to talk about it because I don't think of this as a power card. I thought of this as an asset card that helps you cheat out cards early, similar to something like Mr. Negative. That's just helping you cheat out additional cards at a faster pace. And that's how I saw RSM, but obviously with even more RNG. However, after playing with it a bit, I do think you can make a case that this is a power card. I do think, all in all, you are cheating out so much power so quickly that it's worth seeing as a power card. I do think that it would be on stat line. If I'm truly evaluating this as a 7, it would need to be a 715. I think it is reliably cheating out 15 power. If you want to continue to view this as a 6 cost card, since there isn't like a permanent 7th turn, then it would be above stat line. It would be a 15 when most 6 costs should be aiming for at least a 13. So however you want to perceive it, I'm going to perceive it as on stat line, but I think you could view it as above stat line. I also just want to say that I think what you're about to see, me evaluating all the cards here in a second, would help you out. The more that you can start to rationalize that the stat lines are different than what you've been hearing, that 3 costs should be giving you at least 7 power in some form of fashion, the better you will be at RSM. I don't think if you have a firm grasp of what your real stat line should be, that RSM is a good card for you. So until you feel comfortable with what I'm about to talk about here in a second, I would hold off on this purchase. But cool, I just wanted to throw that in. Please enjoy the actual video. Last little thing before we officially get started. I think I prefaced this at the beginning, but we're just covering about half of the Marvel Snap cards in this episode. These are specifically the cards that are like meant to give you power. They're meant to give you power in these locations. Certain cards like Jeff, we don't play for power. We play for like accessibility. It helps us get into locations that we otherwise can't. So cards like Jeff aren't in this batch of cards that we're going to be reviewing today. These are just cards that help you get power. Okay, and then we're also going to be doing it alphabetically. So to start, Abomination. Abomination's a 5/9. I'm only going to be evaluating this as a high evolutionary version. I don't think anyone plays this normally unless you're still Series 1 or 2 maybe. So Abomination is a 5/9. Its ideal power is a 9. It can't really change that about itself. However, what it can change is how much it costs. And I think instead of subtracting sort of its RNG, I should be adding to its RNG. You're making its RNG better and better as you lower its costs. And effectively, if you can get this down to even a 3, I think that it is above stat line. Obviously, if you can get it all the way to a 0, that's broken. It's one of the best 5 costs at that level. But we can be a little bit realistic and assume we don't get there every time. Even if it's just a 3, it's above its stat line. Next up is Agatha Harkness. Agatha Harkness' whole gimmick is that it messes you up. Hence why it has -2 disruption. It's not helping you in any way. And so even though it's a 14 power on here, I think that it effectively loses 2 costs and is effectively a 6/12, which is below our stat line. Hot garbage. Next up is America Chavez. It gives 2 power to the next card in your deck, basically meaning that it's a 1/4, but we have to remember that it's going to take an extra turn to see that 2 power. There's a situation too at hand where you don't even really want to play that card for a long time, meaning that we don't really see our power in return for a while. So I feel like with that in mind in the formula, America Chavez stays at a 1/2. We would like it to be a 1/3, so it's just below our stat line. Angela is next. This should say 2/3, but it says 2/0 right now. This is sort of an older tier list I'm using. 2/3, I'm going to say optimistically, right? Ideal scenario, we can hit this 7 times. We can get to 210. That'd be like a crazy. Angela did everything that it needed to do and gave me 10 power. Awesome. Obviously, we can't rely on that every time, so we're going to say -2 in terms of the RNG. It does take a few turns for this to really activate. We need other cards. And the big thing is the power needed. Typically, Angela is seeing things like Kitty Pryde or some sort of bounce mechanic to where you are being forced to like play those cards. Additional power is required to get this to a 210. So when you plug in all those numbers, when you plug in all those numbers, it ends up being a 2/4, which is just below stat line. It is not as good as it once was. I did for fun try to explore with the old Angela as a 2/0, where it got 2 each turn, and that was on stat line, but as it stands right now, below stat line. Next up is Annihilus. Annihilus's whole gimmick is to send negative cards or your bad cards to your opponent, and so we should account for that in the power. Ideally, we have our Sentry out and our Hood out, and we're sending over negative 10 power at minimum, so that effectively makes us a 516. Obviously, there is some RNG to that. We might not get those cards in the order we need them, so I subtracted 5. It does disrupt to our opponent, so I gave it back +2. But because it requires other cards, it kind of needs another turn, so I subtracted that 2 back. It ends up staying around a 511, which is exactly what we want from our 5 cost. This is just your generic good 5 cost card. Next, Ant-Man. I think this is probably going to be my first hot take. I've never seen anyone really say this about Ant-Man. But Ant-Man gives you +4 if you can fill out your location, which means that it's a 1/5 with no other variables to account for. A 1/5 is 2 above our stat line. It makes it one of the best 1-cost cards that you can play. I think that Ant-Man is an S-tier card, and more people should be playing it, albeit you should tend to play it later in the match and not at the beginning. Automa. Automa blows up if he is accompanied by another card. Typically, you have to play this with Armor or Invisible Woman to have it really be worth anything, which is sometimes a bad combination to sort of rely on. I'm going to give this a -2 to ourselves. I think Automa is just a bad card to sort of lock yourself into, especially since there's other cards that are single and worth more than that, even within the 4-cost section. To play this is a detriment to yourself. If you are playing this and you think that it is good, I think it is something worth reconsidering. Automa is hot garbage. Baron Zemo, 3/5. Baron Zemo summons one of your opponent's cards to its side of the field, so we should account for that in its cost. Obviously, that gives a little bit of RNG, so we're going to subtract a -3, but add 2 to the disruption. I think optimally, we can hope for at least a 3-cost card to come over on our side, which all in all would make it a 3/7, which is exactly what we want from our 3-cost card. Baron Zemo sometimes gets some flack, but I think it's just where it needs to be. It's your standard 3-cost card. Beta Ray Bill, 4-cost. I forget what the name of the hammer is for Beta Ray Bill, but it summons the hammer into your deck. If you draw it, it will double the power, effectively making it a 4/12. That's the ideal situation. Maybe some people argue it's really a 4/24 because you're typically comboing this with Odin. From what I've witnessed from other people playing it, it isn't the most reliable situation. I think there's heavy RNG. I think the 2-turn makes it bad. Even if you make it 24, that would make it so that other power is sort of needed. You need the Jane Foster in there to where really, even if I did the combination of 24, Beta Ray Bill just isn't a good card. I'm tempted to say hot garbage, but I'll say just below stat line for now. Bishop, a 3/1, but every time you play a card, you get an extra point. Let's say optimistically we're able to play 9 additional cards after we play Bishop. Obviously, there's some variability to that, so we're going to subtract 3. I think that's realistic. I've seen Bishop get up to 9. Typically, we see this with some sort of zoo or bounce meta. It could be argued that it is just below stat line, but I feel like Bishop is good and can still be applied to other places. I don't feel too bad about the 10. That's very similar to what we try to get Angela toward. So I feel like Bishop is your standard 3-cost card. Black Knight. Black Knight, after you discard, you get an Ebony Blade that matches the value of the card you discarded, so it takes a lot of setup. The ideal scenario is that you are discarding an Infinite, and you're getting a free 420 that doesn't require you to skip a turn, right? And then maybe you can even cheat that out with Ghost Rider. That's typically your dream case scenario. Does that happen often? No, but that's your dream case scenario, so let's just look at it through that lens. Obviously, it has variability, but since it's a 1 cost, we're kind of okay risking that RNG sometimes. The big thing is it takes 3 turns, and it requires a lot of other power, like the card to discard, and we have to summon the Ebony Blade on top of it, making it so that the multiplier, in terms of how much we have to do to even get our reward, is pretty bad. Even with our optimal scenario of getting the Infinite, it does turn out to be just below stat line. Maybe too much risk for not enough reward. Black Panther, we talked about Black Panther earlier. I think this is a 16. If you're looking at this as a 5/8, that's just wrong. I think people feel bad if it's only a 5/8. We have to combo into it, so I'm going to look at this as at least a 5/16. Obviously, there is some RNG to that. We might not get the rolls that we need to get it up there, so we subtract 5. and it's going to take at least another card like Shuri or Odin to get it to 516. And so with that a part of the equation, it does end up just below the stat line. It is a little bit, again, kind of like Beta Ray Bill, too much risk, not enough reward. Next up is Blink. Blink will substitute one of the cards you just played last turn for a new card. We can optimistically assume that that's going to be a little bit higher value if we're strategically playing, getting rid of one of our low costs for a high cost card, potentially even giving us like a +9 situation. Okay, that's ideal, not typically what happens, but I'm going to give it its ideal scenario, subtract it to RNG. I'm going to say Blink is your standard 5/7 cost card. 5/11 cost card on stat line. Next is Blob. Blob will take the remaining of your deck and get to at least 15, if not higher. Ideally, we'd like to see it at least get to 20. Now with its new like phrasing, it is kind of hard to reliably get there. So there is RNG. Sometimes when I've like play tested with Blob, sometimes I don't even get to 15, even when my deck is like designed to get it there. So I definitely feel like the RNG is warranted. Even with that said, though, with our ideal and our RNG calculated, it is slightly above stat line. I think if you design your deck well around Blob, Blob is one of the more... It is a very good final piece to play on 6, and it is slightly above stat line. A big shocker for me when I was doing this, I am super surprised what I'm about to say with Blue Marvel. But Blue Marvel, it's a 5/3. It gives +1 to all the remaining cards. Let's say optimistically, we've filled out all of our board state and it's 11 extra power on top of this 3, and that makes it a 5/14. Obviously, there's some variability. We might not be able to completely fill our board, so we have to subtract the 5 from the equation, and that ends up making it a 9. We want an 11 out of our 5 cards. That's what we should be expecting. I thought Blue Marvel was good. But once I started thinking about it this way and I sort of stopped using Blue Marvel in my decks, I did see better returns. I think that's one of the key cards where you kind of have to change your perspective. Blue Marvel seems good, but once you also start thinking about it in terms of it's really just 4 extra power in a location and there's just better things you could be doing, you start to realize more and more that Blue Marvel, as it currently stands, is bad. It is just below stat line. Not going to say hot garbage, but not quite what we would like from it. Next is Brood. Brood summons 2 copies, effectively making it a 3/6. Obviously, we hope to combo this. This is more of a combo piece with like Silver Surfer usually. There's some other weird tactics out there. So I get that there might be some confusion in terms of like why we say this is a 3/6. But I also want to start looking at these cards in terms of like, can I just apply this power elsewhere? Because we're actually going to give like all the power that Silver Surfer gives to Brood to Silver Surfer itself later once we get there. So we have to keep this as just a 3/6. There's no RNG. It's pretty much always going to be a 3/6 unless you're playing it in a weird location. So it is below stat line, though it does feel like one of the better cards. Another maybe shocker for some people that it's not quite highly ranked as a 3 cost. Next is Cannonball, a 5/9 that moves the highest cost card or highest power card in the opponent's location. This card is broken. Even throughout the changes, I think if through optimal play, it is still just a really good swing in a location. We have to add that power that you're moving away from the location to it. Technically, it still exists, but if you're just trying to win a location, it is a big swing in that location's favor. I feel like optimistically, you're at least dealing with a 9 cost card, thus making it a 5/17. You are disrupting. There is some RNG, I guess, depending on like where that high cost card goes, or even like what the high cost card that you're dealing with is. But even after all that, it ends up being 3 above stat line, and that makes it one of the best 5 cost cards. It is S tier. Captain America. Captain America recently changed how it works. Now it gives +2 to all ongoing cards in your location. What we see here is incorrect. It's not a 3/2, so it'd be 2, 4, 6. That means it's a 3. So it's a 3/3, and it gives +2 to all of that in its location, thus making it a 3/9. We're looking for a 3/7. As long as you're playing it optimally, you should always be able to get a 3/9. New Captain America above stat line. I haven't seen a lot of it played. I think it should be reconsidered in a lot of decks. Another kind of unique one, Carnage. Ideally, if you play it in the right spot, it ends up being a 2/8. It doesn't typically end up being in that, which is why I'm giving it an RNG. Sometimes you feel the need to use the Carnage earlier in order to get some combos going. So I'm going to take away the -2 in terms of like RNG optimal play. But I'm going to give it back its +2, not because it actually disrupts anything the opponent's doing, but just because the restore factor is so good. Disruption is typically a really popular meta right now within the game, and being able to eliminate some of the disruption that your opponent gives you and restore your state of the board is just a really good second use for Carnage, to where I've even been tempted to just throw Carnage in a non-destroy meta type deck and have seen good returns. I've also seen that pretty popularized on a lot of other decks that like Reddit supports and like tells people to try, and it is pretty good. So if we add that 2 back, it ends up being super above stat line. It's one of the best 2-cost cards, especially if you start looking at through the lens that it's not just for destroy, but more of a restore your state of the board back to where it should be. And also just 2/8 on an optimal situation is really good. Cerebro. Cerebro is sometimes seen as sort of a gimmicky card, and I think you might be surprised where this is going to be going. But let's say ideal scenario, we're hitting at least 9 of our cards and giving it +2 power. Obviously, if you're going hard on Cerebro, that should be the objective. I'm going to go ahead and subtract 2, though, because you are sort of doing a gimmick, so you're putting yourself at a disadvantage inherently. There is obviously RNG. Typically with locations, it's hard to sometimes keep all of your cards at the cost that they need to be. And I'm also going to add 6 in terms of turns needed, because everything that you're doing is designed around making Cerebro activate. If you don't get Cerebro off, it often feels like your deck was a failure. So everything you're doing is designed around Cerebro. There is no like casual turn in a Cerebro style deck. But even with all those negatives applied to the equation, it still ends up being right where it needs to be on stat line. Cerebro isn't a bad card, just where it needs to be. Next up is Collector. Collector adds +1 for every card that you add to your hand that did not start in your deck, or rather, did not come from your deck, like you didn't draw it. Let's say ideal scenario, you get up to 10. That's typically my theme. I said this earlier with like Angela and Bishop. That just feels like the right number to sort of shoot for with cards like these. Obviously, there's variability, so we subtract 2. There's a lot of power needed as well. Like you have to play certain cards to get it to where it needs to be. I didn't want to overload that with too much in the power needed sector, but I feel like an extra 4 cost is totally fair in order to get the Collector to feel worth it. With just those simple equations put in mind and with an optimal power, it's still below stat line. I don't think Collector is anywhere near as good as it once was in previous metas. Crossbones is a 4/10. As long as you're winning the location, you can play this card here. Its ideal power is obviously 10. Doesn't really do anything other than the fact that it does require some previous turns to be optimally placed in order for you to even put this card down. So I feel like that does take away at least 2 points from it. Ends up being a 4/8. Even though it's a really good power, you don't really see it a lot. And I feel like if you're wondering why Crossbones isn't played a lot, it's just that simple reason of just it requires optimal play before it. It doesn't save you. It's more of like the rich gets richer type card, which isn't typically what we're looking for in a power. So it's just below stat line. However, there is another card that is super good and a much better, it's actually the best 4/10 in my opinion, Cold Obsidian. All it requires is that you have a 1 cost before you play it down. Every deck should have at least 2 1 costs in it, in my opinion, and it should be very easy to accomplish this goal. So this is a 4/10 with no caveats, no variables. This is above stat line. This is one of the better 4-cost cards, and definitely the best 4/10. Dagger. Dagger is obviously move related. I mentioned earlier that I was going to try and avoid some like cards that typically have to be in a certain type of meta to even be relevant, but really you only pick Dagger because of its power potential. I feel like 10 is probably not even the ideal. You're maybe even trying to get this like 14, 16, 18, but I feel like 10 is usually pretty realistic. Even just 1 move gets it to an 8, and you might even cheat out like a little bit more with it. So 10 felt fair. Obviously is unsure what you're actually going to get out of it, so there's RNG, and it does require some setup, even if it's just like a Spider Gwen or a Iron Fist that's moving it just 1 time. But even with all those things said, it is slightly above stat line. I think Dagger is really good. A year or so back, there was like a nice little combo where it was just like Iron Fist and Dagger, and that's it. And there was no other move cards, and that sometimes would just steal games. Like, it's just a nice little 3-piece combo to steal 10 power. Decken. Decken is a 3/4. Once you play it, you get a shard in your hand, and if you can either discard or destroy that, it doubles its power into a 3/8. This was probably ideally actually a 3/16. I did do the math on that, and the verdict ends up being the same. It just requires a little too many steps. The variability is still present, and no matter how you slice it, Dakin just isn't quite the right stat line. It needs to be just below. I'm even tempted, actually, I need to be a little bit harsher with cards. I think this one's just hot garbage. I think it just takes too many steps to actually make this effective. Hopefully this one day changes to something a little bit more appealing, like a 3-5. 3-6 might be too good in terms of like it's even good now. Well, yeah, I don't know. At least a 3-5 to even start considering this card. I think it's hot garbage at a 3-4. Darkhawk 5-3. Add +2 power for each card in your opponent's deck. I thought optimistically we can make sure that there's still at least 7 cards in the deck after things like Rockslide and Korg and a Black Widow type situation. We can usually at least hope that this is a 5-17. It does disrupt, so we're going to add 2, but obviously there's variability in terms of what stays in the deck, so we're going to subtract 5. It does require a lot of turns to set up. You have to play certain cards to get this going. I didn't put this in the power needed section because typically you play these cards anyway, but obviously if you don't draw your Rockslide or Korg until the very end of the deck, Darkhawk is at a detriment because of that. So it does require other turns before it to be good. Even with that in mind though, it stays on stat line. It's a solid 5-cost card. Dazzler. Dazzler is ideally a 2-8. We fill up our whole side of the board. Obviously, there is some chance that that doesn't work out, and so we take away 2 points for its cost, but that leaves it at a 2-6. Optimally, this is a really good 2-cost card, especially when you can control what you're doing on your side of the board. Deadpool. Deadpool, every time you destroy it, it multiplies its current cost. I felt like 16 was a reliable like expectation that you're hoping to get each time that you play Deadpool. I feel like even if it was just 8 though, that's like perfectly fine. The RNG of this is only -1. Like if we're wrong and Deadpool doesn't work out exactly like we thought it would, it isn't the biggest deal. It does require a lot of turns though. You have to keep playing it. You have to have certain cards to destroy. It does require a little bit of optimal play. I maybe could have been a little harsher on Deadpool, but even with some numbers skewed a little bit up or down, it's clearly above stat line, and it is one of the better 1-cost cards. I would still say Ant-Man is better than Deadpool just because Ant-Man can go in any meta, and Deadpool does sort of have to be destroy specific. But in terms of like what a 1-cost can do for you, Deadpool is one of the best. Death. Death is a 8-12. Each time you destroy something, it loses one of its costs and it ends up going down. So this is very similar to what we were talking about with Abomination, to where our RNG, instead of subtracting, we're actually going to add some stuff back to it because it gets cheaper and cheaper. I'm not going to give it its 8 because I feel like the higher it goes, that's actually a little bit more of a detriment. So we're going to keep it at the 6 because it is theoretically like a 6-cost card. But obviously you cannot play this on 1. Pretty much given any scenario, you do have to have at least something get destroyed before this becomes feasible to play, even if it's on 7, thanks to like a turn 7 magic. So it does require that. But even with all that said, it's a 15 on the formula, which makes it one of the better 6-cost cards. It is definitely above stat line. Destroyer, sort of the opposite of Death in certain ways. This is a 6-16. It's a detriment to you, usually, even if you're playing optimally and you only have like a Colossus and a Nimrod and a Bucky Barnes that isn't killed yet. Typically, this is still disrupting. You're limiting yourself on what you can play at worst, even if everything on your board is like favorable in terms of being destroyed, to where I feel like it does take away 2. But there's really nothing else I can say about it in terms of the formula, and just -2 points still keeps it as a 6-14. If you can make it work, it is one of the better 6-cost cards. It's above stat line. Dr. Octopus, a 5-10 on reveal. Take cards from your opponent's hand and fill them up in the location as much as possible. Obviously, that gives your opponent power, but more than anything, it's usually disruption. You're messing with like the way that they wanted to play certain cards. You're also usually locking them into like that's the amount of power that they have in the location. And as long as you didn't play that as your 3rd or 4th slot, usually you have at least some time to fix what's going on in that location if you have some other high power 2, 3, 1 costs in your hand. And so really there's nothing else to say in the variability of it. I think some people argue that Dr. Octopus is bad. It isn't truly a 10 because of what's happening on the other side of the side, on your opponent's side, because they're gaining power. And so like it all cancels out. But I disagree. I don't think that's actually that noteworthy. I think the disruption is more noteworthy than the power, the quote unquote power that they're gaining on that side. So I think this is straight up just a 5/12. It's a 10 with a 2 disruption sort of sentiment to it, and that makes it above stat line. I think Dr. Octopus is one of the best 5-cost cards, but it is one of those cards where it's like it works perfectly for your opponent and it never works perfectly for you. I get that sentiment, but get lucky, get more lucky. Devil Dinosaur, 5/3. Each card in your hand, it gives it +2. Obviously, it's impossible to have 7 cards in your hand. Well, I guess it's not impossible. It's very unlikely because you don't want to skip your last turn. You got to play something usually. So I worked on it as if it was 6 cards in your hand. I think I did that. Oh, no, I didn't. I did my math wrong. Okay, so it should be a 5/15. There should be 6 cards in your hand because you don't want to skip turn 6, which would mean that is 15 minus 5, which is 10, which means it's just below stat line. I did my math wrong on that one right there, but let's call it even. I don't feel comfortable saying Devil Dinosaur is just below stat line, especially in early series 1, series 2, series 3. I'm gonna say Devil Dinosaur is just a normal card that kind of stays relevant no matter what happens to it in OTAs. I guess it is technically possible that you play a card on 7 that replenishes your hand, so we'll keep it at 17. I guess that is the ideal scenario. But we'll call it even. We'll leave it on stat line. Drax, 4/5. Ideally, this triggers and you get it as a 4/9. This is our first sort of guardian of the tier list so far. I don't feel as though at the state of the game where turn 4 takes place, it's reliable enough to guarantee you're going to predict where Drax needs to go correctly. And so I put that there's RNG here. You'll see that I don't do that for a card coming up in about 4 cards, but Drax is still a variable to me. You can't guarantee where the opponent's going to play, and because of that, it is effectively a 4/5. You have to assume that you're going to miss, and that makes it below stat line. I'm actually even going to put it in hot garbage. You have to assume you're going to miss with Drax, and that just isn't worth the risk as a 4-cost. Eddie Maw, 1/7. This one's one of the harder ones to calculate for. Typically, you have to play this before 3. Obviously, there's Sauron decks. Sometimes you can cheat it out in other ways. So I'm still going to say it's a disruption to you personally. Typically, when it's played, you are restricting that location to yourself or making it very difficult to enter. There is a little bit of RNG to it in terms of how soon you can draw it. If you don't draw it in time, it's not any of use to you. It's one of the few cards that has a strict countdown like that. But even when I took away those numbers from its value, it still was slightly above stat line. Ebony Maw might be worth considering, especially if you have enough tactics to work with that location if and when it gets played. Elsa Bloodstone, 3/3, adds 2 power to the last card in a location. I said that we could trigger that at least, let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8, at least 4 times. We could try and trigger that 4 times and get at least a 3/11 out of it tactfully. Obviously, there's some RNG to it, so I take away 3, and it requires other cards to work, though maybe not as many as we might think. Even with some generous numbers, though, it does kind of tend to be below stat line. It ends up as a 6 total score instead of a 7. It just doesn't, when it works, but it just doesn't often enough. So I think it's just below stat line, not quite as good as people hype it up to be. Forge, very similar to America Chavez. It is adding 2 power to the next card. The difference is, as I mentioned earlier, America Chavez, sometimes you don't want to play that next card that you drew. You're going to play that next card anyway with Forge. So I meant to change this, another one where I slightly messed up. The final score should be 4, but it is still below stat line. We want a 2/5 out of things, not just 4 power from a 2. If it gave 3 power to something, this would be a perfect 2-cost card. I think as it stands, it is just below stat line. My score might imply hot garbage, but it's just a little off. Next up is Gamora, our second guardian. 5/8, if you're able to predict your opponent, you get +4 power. The difference here, I feel like if you're skilled enough of a player at this state in the game, it should be decently obvious. I feel like in your favor, at least 66%, if not more, that you predict where they're going to go, or that you've set up an effective trap enough to predict reliably where they're going to go. And if they don't go there, it's okay because it's still just power in your location. The 5-turn and 6-turn are just you can usually predict it, especially in a meta heavy game like this where everyone sort of follows streamlined cards, to where Gamora, I don't think there is that much RNG to it, and it is a 5/12, which makes it above its stat line. I think if you know what you're doing, Gamora is a better 5-cost card than most. Next up, Ghost Rider 4/3. It summons something that you discarded. Obviously, that's going to take a few steps. Optimistically, we discarded our Infinite and we're getting that out for free. I put that stuff in the formula. It still turns out to be a decent card, one above and slightly above stat line. This was another thing, just like Dagger, where people would just sometimes throw Lady Sif and Ghost Rider, even if it wasn't a discard deck, just to cheat out some really good power. And it tends to work. It's not bad as just like a random duo to throw in your deck and hope to trigger. Giganto 614. I put -2 on disruption. You are limiting yourself to like leave space open in your left. If the left happens to be like a really good location, you still have to sort of make sure there's room for it to put Giganto there. And like that enough to me is bad. I don't like that it's only forced to be in one location. To me, that is worthy to take away 2 points, which makes it a 612. We need a 613 to have a good stat line. Again, this feels like a really powerful card. It's free power. It's 14. That's huge. It's a lot bigger than a lot of things with less work. Yet you don't see it a lot. And so if you've ever just kind of wondered to yourself, why don't I see Giganto? I feel like it's this subtle formula that does make a lot of sense and is ever present in terms of why you don't see it. Because to me, if I'm just looking at it briefly, it makes sense to play Giganto. It's very easy power, yet you don't see it a lot. And it's because of this. That little thing of it can only be in the left is enough to make it lose some points, metaphorically, and that makes it not quite where it needs to be, just below stat line. Gilgamesh 5/7 +1 power for every card that has been increased in power on your board. Optimistically, we can hope our whole board is filled. We can give it an extra 11. And then obviously that is a variable, which would make it lose 5 power. And then obviously it does take a few turns to set up. Ideally, we have something like Blue Marvel that's triggering it to help get it there for us. I am realizing that I did my math wrong again. It should be 18 total if it's 11 for everything. But I guess whatever is making everything have power is triggering on Gilgamesh. And I might have been thinking that. And that's why it's technically a 519. So never mind, no mistakes. Because of that extra power, whatever's happening to everything else is happening to Gilgamesh. It is above stat line. Gladiator 3/8. It is going to summon one of your opponent's cards on their side of the field. If it is less than 8, it gets destroyed. If it's 8 or higher, it stays on the board. This is effectively like a Dr. Octopus, but as a 3 cost. Again, some people worry that because you are giving your opponent a free on reveal, usually when it gets summoned, pardon me, or if it stays on the board, that's just too much of a risk. I think that is wrong. I think if you're playing it optimally, even if you're playing it on an opponent's side where it's all filled up and it doesn't even trigger, that's just really good. This can easily be a true 3/8, but when putting it into the formula of adding 2 for disruption, taking away 3 for RNG, it stays as a 7/7. It is just a solid 3-cost card, though personally, I would like to see it as above stat line, but I'll honor the formula and say that it's just a solid 3-cost. Groot, we've kind of talked about this before. Groot is just too early in the game to properly predict because the RNG ends up being hot garbage, just like Drax. Hawkeye is a 1-cost that if you play something here on the next reveal, it ends up being a 1/4. Typically, we like to bounce this. People usually aren't satisfied if it's only triggered once. So I put the IP as 7. It does require a lot of turns. It does require you to at least set up Beast or Falcon to get it back in your hand, and then you have to play it again. So it does require a few turns and a few power, which makes that 1/7 not really true. And to me, it is still just a 1/2. It's also locked into a certain meta. I'm going to be a little bit more cruel to Hawkeye. Even though a lot of people have warmed up to it, I'm going to say it's still hot garbage. Hulk. We could look at this as normal Hulk. I only entertain high evolutionary Hulk. We should be able to skip at least one turn, or not even skip, just play off curve one turn comfortably to where this is always a 6/14 with no real detriment to ourselves. Obviously, it can be much higher, and we can pretty reliably, I feel comfortable not applying RNG to this, say that it's above stat line. It's a better Giganto, in my opinion. It is going to be a 6/14 that we can play anywhere. Hitmonkey, I'm going to assume that we can play at least 5 other cards with us, whether that's like a Mysterio or a Squirrel Girl, whatever, that's helping it get there. Squirrel Girl might not proc it. I don't play Hitmonkey that often. Definitely Mysterio, though. Hopefully we can get it to a 3/12. I think that is a realistic expectation to set for Hitmonkey. Obviously, there is some RNG. It does take a little bit of setup, but with those things in the equation, it ends up being just a nice little 3-cost card. Infinite 620. 620, but we have to skip a turn. We have to not play any cards the turn before we play it. I think that is a big detriment. We need to apply that to the power needed. Effectively, typically, you're skipping turn 5, which means you use 5 power to do nothing. And then you're playing this on top of it. That means it's 11 power for 11 cost for 20 power, which means once we add that to the equation, it's effectively a 9, and we cannot do a 6-9. Typically, we don't play Infinite. We try to trigger in other ways, like with Ghost Rider, or maybe with Hela or Lockjaw if you're still crazy and playing Lockjaw. So I know that Infinite isn't played this way, but we have to look at it as if that's like our only option. If we're stuck with Infinite as our only play, is it good to do? And no, it's not. So I acknowledge that maybe Infinite is better than what this formula is saying because we don't actually play Infinite, but I'm going to stick with the formula. I've always believed that Infinite is hot garbage. Iron Man 5-0, but doubles your location and makes the power stronger. I'm going to assume that we would like to get a lot of power out of this. I'll be transparent. This is the one card where I kind of rigged the formula. Originally, I was like, I think 10 power is realistic. Like if I put it on a 10 and make it a 520, I'm comfortable with that. But that didn't make it, that made it a bad card, and I don't think there's anything that could make Iron Man bad. It's just one of those good cards. Maybe like you should count everything that it's doing. If you put it on a 10, it is technically that 10. It makes it the full 20. So maybe the ideal power should be 20 appropriately, but I struggled with this card. This is just a good card. Maybe it's the exception to the rule that proves that the formula works, but that's what I put it at as the finale for the formula. Ironheart 3-0, but gives 2 power to at least 3 other cards. I kind of said that wrong. To 3 other cards, it'll give 2 power. I'm going to hope that we trigger this, right? So I, multiple times, like we put it on a Wong or we Odin it somehow, and it's going to give at least like 12 power. So if you see there, it says Ironheart, even if comboed. I did do another formula where it's giving like 12 power. It's always just 1 shy though. So it ends up being just below stat line. I think it's a good card. It's just not quite where it needs to be. If it was a 3-1, I think that would be a perfect 3-cost card. Jessica Jones is a 4-9. You play it, and as long as you don't play in that same location, you'll get 4 power. It's pretty easy to do. It's especially really good in early series. Jessica Jones is an easy, good, solid on-stat line 4-cost card. Khazar 4-4 gives 1 power to all 1-cost cards. I'm going to assume that we can fill out most of our, at least get 9 1s on the board to give it to a 13. Obviously, there's some variability to that, and it does take some specific turns. You are sort of putting yourself at a detriment by loading up with 1-cost cards. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. When it doesn't, it does not, though. I actually think people should sort of abandon Khazar. I think that would make Marvel Snap maybe choose to make it a little bit better. We live for the days where Khazar gives +2 to +1s. Till then, I truly think Khazar is hot garbage and not a meta worth pursuing. Kitty Pryde, a 1-1. Every time you play it, it bounces back to your hand and gains 1 power. This is typically a chain... Oh, actually, I don't have Kitty Pryde on my formula, but hypothetically, this is typically like a chain reaction card. I don't think that Kitty Pryde is super worth it since one of the main things it works with is Angela. I don't have the formula up for it, but basically Kitty Pryde is going to be just below stat line. It's not going to be the best 1-cost card. I think it's sort of a trap into tricking you into playing bounce when it's not the best meta. Okay, next up for what I actually do have is Claw. Claw is effectively a 5-12. It is 4 costs on itself and it spreads 8. I know that's not 12 in one location, but a 5-12 is just too good to ignore. There's no stipulations to it. It's an easy above stat line. Null. Null obviously needs to be in a specific type of meta in order to work appropriately. But we can realistically hope that it gets to 20. I think if you're under 20, you are a little bit dissatisfied with the card. That is the goal, trying to get there. Obviously, there's some variability, so we subtract 6, ends up still being a 14. Solid 6-cost card above what we would like to see it as. Next is Lizard. Nope. Next is Living Tribunal. Living Tribunal spreads the power across so that whatever's in... Well, yeah, it just spreads your power across. So if you have 30 power total, it ends up being 10 in each location. That ends up being useful. It's more of an accessibility card than a power card. When it first came out and was released, it was much lower than the 9 here because it was pitched that way. It's supposed to be an accessibility card, not really get high power and spread it everywhere. It's, I think Living Tribunal might even be better if you played it more as a disruption than a Hela meta, which is what most people do. They play as a Hela meta right now. But as it currently stands, to me, ideally, you're hoping that you at least spread 20 power to other places based on how it's currently played. That variability is often not where you want it to be, so we subtract 6 and also requires a decent amount of setup. I'll say that it's where it needs to be. I don't think it's one of the better 6-cost cards, but it serves its function in terms of what you want it to be. Next is Lizard. I hope. Yeah, okay, good. Lizard, 2/5. Lots of people are scared of Lizard because if your opponent fills up the other side, it becomes a 2/1. I don't think that is what you should see it as. Similar to Dr. Octopus and Gladiator, you need to view it as disruption. If your opponent is for some reason obsessed with the idea of getting Lizard down to a 2/1 and they're stacking one location, cool, that allows you to work on other locations. That is worth the investment to me, especially as a 2-cost card. Pardon me, that I'm okay if my opponent decides to do something like that. Obviously, it's a variable whether or not they succeed in doing it or not, or whether I succeed in keeping it as a 5-cost card. So we give it 2 for the disruption aspect, that it's tricking our opponent into doing it. And if they don't do it, great, it stays a 5-cost card, right? And then we subtract 2 for that iffy, will they, won't they, trigger my Lizard, which is a funny phrase. And then it stays as a 5, so I think it's an on-stat line card. It's exactly what we want as a 2-cost card. Next up is Magneto. Magneto is a 6/12, and it causes some disruption. It moves your 3 and 4-cost cards. I can't tell you how many games I've played with Wong, and then I didn't have priority, and so they played Magneto. It moved my Wong, and then my chain of events did not go off as I needed it to. That's just one core example, but there's lots of things that it messes up. It can mess up Silver Surfer decks. It can mess up lots of other metas that have like important 3s and 4s. So with that in mind, it gets +2 and it goes above stat line. It's one of the better ones. I almost won't even want to say it's one of the best 6-cost cards, but we're getting closer and closer to a really big surprise contender that's in the 6-cost card category. And sorry, I'm not scrolling as much as I should, but here's a current look at everything real quick. But Magneto's in the above stat line. Next up is Martyr. Martyr is a 1/5, but if it can lose the game, it will lose the game, which means it moves from the location at the end if for whatever reason moving would make you lose the game. I think that has made a lot of people scared of it, sort of a reverse Captain Marvel, but I really think if you're playing optimally, it's not that scary. There's plenty of ways to make sure that it doesn't trigger. This is basically a 1/5 with no stipulations. I can sense that people maybe want to say that it is RNG and whether or not it will trigger, but really it isn't. It's up to you, I think. This is a skill card, not an RNG card. As long as you play optimally, it will not go off, which makes it, surprise, surprise, an S-tier card. I don't think I've ever seen Martyr get that much praise, but I truly believe Martyr is one of the best 1-cost cards you could have in your deck, and I feel like I've become a much better player since I've considered putting it in my deck just because of the power that it provides. Maximus. Maximus is hot garbage. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. Giving your opponent cards is the worst thing you can do. That's why it loses to detriment. I know a lot of people don't play it that way. They find ways to make the on-reveal not happen, whether it's playing into a Cosmo or playing into a 0 or just playing it last. That's still bad for me. That requires too much turn and like card-specific order to make this worth it. I don't like it. It's hot garbage. Never give your opponent cards, never consider it, and there's better 2-costs out there. Medusa is a 2/5. As long as you play it in the middle. Some people might think that this is similar to Giganto, where you feel very limited in where you can put it. The difference is Giganto literally can't go anywhere else. The game won't let you. As a worst case scenario, you could always put Medusa somewhere else, so it does have sort of some variability, but typically, especially since early game, there's really nothing stopping you other than a bad location with Medusa going there. But even if it's a bad location, it's still early enough game to where you can pivot pretty easily. I don't think there's any RNG to consider here or any bad side effects to consider. Medusa's just your standard 2-cost card, 2/5. Spider-Man's a 4/5. So I'm going to say that Spider-Man is actually a 1/5, and I'm saying Spider-Man, but I mean Spider-Man Miles Morales. I'm going to say that's actually a 1 cost, and it's also now a 4/6, not a 4/5, as you see here. As long as something moves, it becomes that 1 cost, and you can play it next turn. So it does require a little bit of setup. And so I took that away from it, but it stays as a 4. I think it's one of the better 1 cost cards. Obviously, if you view it as a 4 cost card, it's bad, but I think it's meant to be seen as a 1 cost card, and for that reason, it is above stat line. Mockingbird is a 5/9. It goes down in cost for every card that did not start in your deck that is on the field. Lots of people have found really good ways to synergize this. A really good sneaky play is to Moon Girl your Mockingbird, because then the Moon Girl creates copies that make it cheaper, and then often you can even get this down to 0/9s, 2 0/9s, which makes it one of the best 5-cost cards in the game. If I could include the Moon Girl meta in the formula, it would be one of the best 5-cost cards, but with the formula as it stands right now, it is just above stat line. Mojo. This is the card that I wish I could make a whole video essay on just by itself. This card does not get any respect that it deserves. It's a 2/2, and if your side location and your opponent's side location is filled, it's a 2/8. And I think lots of people see this and they think that's too unreliable, and so it's just a 2/2 in their eyes. I'm here to tell you that if you can play optimally, this is always a 2/8. In a different video, when I go over like how to handle locations better, there are just so many locations now that require your opponent to focus on 2 rather than all 3. I generally don't typically see Marvel Snap as a 3-location game. It is typically a 2-location game, and then you do some like extra stuff at the last second for the 3rd location. There's just tons of locations where it destroys you as soon as you play a card there, and unless you're playing a destroy meta, it's useless to you. There's lots of locations that have limited access. There's lots of locations that transform your card. There's lots of locations that make your card switch over. There's just lots and lots of variables that you need to be considering, especially at current Marvel Snap existence in meta, that Mojo to me is always a 2/8. I feel bad putting -2 in the RNG column because I've never not been sure that Mojo is going to be a 2/8. And I acknowledge that there's a little bit of a skill curve there, but if you can wrap your mind around it and really learn how the locations work, Mojo is always a 2/8, and I think it's genuinely the best card in the game. I'm putting it right there, stat line wise, what it's worth, what it can do. It's a 2/8. I also even think that Mojo has a little bit of disruption to it. It sometimes prevents your opponent from putting cards there, and also sometimes because the game is so fast, people forget that it gives you +6. If you're up by like 3 and they think they just need to play a 4 and then forget that the 6 is going to add on top of it, that's won me tons of games. Mojo, best card in the game. I hate seeing it anywhere less than that. Next up, Mr. Fantastic, 3/6. That's all it does, especially, and you kind of have to play it in the middle. It's below stat line. I even want to say hot garbage. I really don't like Mr. Fantastic. I feel like I was tricked into liking it in the early series, but I'll be nice. I'll be the bigger man and say just below stat line. Mr. Sinister is a 2/2, gives you a 2/4. This is below stat line. I think Mr. Sinister is garbage. I think people get tricked into playing it. There's better cards to do it. Just play Brood if you're doing anything that requires something like that. Mr. Sinister is not good, never has been. Don't play it. Miss Marvel is a 4/4, but it gives 5 power to each location. I almost think Miss Marvel got an upgrade to, and it's 4/5 right now, and that's why I put 15. I think this is maybe outdated. 15 power across all locations. Even if it's 14, it's still good. This is the much better Mr. Fantastic as well. It does require a little bit of setup. There's a little bit of RNG, I guess. I don't feel comfortable saying it's RNG. I think it's more of a skill card, but I put it there just in case people contested it. But I would say that's on stat line, if not above stat line. Mystique. Mystique is a 3/0, typically copies an ongoing card. I don't feel super comfortable saying that this is a quote-unquote power card, but typically what we're trying to do more often than not is copy an Iron Man, which is giving us power, or like a Null or a Claw, which are all power cards. So I feel like Mystique is more often than not used for power. It typically does what the card before it is doing. It does require 2-turn setup. There also is variability on when you draw this and if it succeeds. But even with that in the formula, it is just a really good 3-cost card. All right, next up is Nakia. Nakia is a 3/3. I think some people can say that this is a sort of a setup card. You're giving power to your other cards. Ideally, you just played this and you're giving it to 6 other cards that you then will play, making it a 3/9. There is some variability to that, obviously, and even in the best case scenarios, this is below stat line to 3/6, but it is one of my more favorite below stat line cards. Namor is next. Remember earlier when I said that Automa was bad as a standalone card because there's even 4 cost cards that do what it wants to do better? Namor is that card. If it's by itself, it gets +5 power and it ends up being a 4/11, but it serves as a better Automa because you could theoretically continue to put cards there and add more power if you needed. In terms of Namor versus Automa, it's an S tier card, but when I put it through the formula, it's still not quite where it needs to be. It's also a little bit disruption to yourself in the same way that Automa is, to where I feel like that's important to add to the equation. If you feel like you can keep playing things on top of Namor without real consequence, I guess you could say that it's on stat line / above stat line, but I want to say it's below stat line still. Anything that acts like Automa is bad. Namora, on the other hand, who I'm going to assume is Namor's sister. That's what I'm going to assume. That's the female of choice. Namora is a 5/6 that adds 5 power to other cards and other locations as long as they are by themselves, which can usually make a pretty reliable 5/16. Obviously, that I thought about putting some numbers in the turns required because you are sort of playing around that mechanic, but every time I've played it, every time I've seen it, it doesn't usually feel that bad. This is one that I would probably get wrong before purchase. I would assume that's a little bit worse than it is because of the setup required to get that off, especially at turn 5. But after playing with it, I think it's one of the most broken cards in the game. I think this is one of the best 5-cost cards. It is an easy S tier for me. Nebula is a 1-cost card that lots of content makers around Marvel Snap say that is a must-grab 1-cost card. Typically, this will trigger at least twice to where I feel like it is a pretty reliable 1/5. It is a little bit of a disruptor. You are inviting people to play their cards there in the same sense that like Lizard activates. There's a little bit of variability. You don't know for sure what you're going to get, and it does require a little bit of turns in order to get it exactly as needed. Not necessarily turned on your half, but turns on their half. With all that numbers included, it ends up being just a normal stat card. I actually don't think Nebula is as hype as it is reported to be. I think it's just fine. Next up is Nimrod. Nimrod is a 5/6, but if you destroy it, you get a clone of it, or 2 clones of it in the other locations, to where it is a pretty reliable 5/12. I feel like maybe you're not super satisfied with a 5/12, and maybe it's a more reliable 5/24. When I made it 5/24 in the formula, though, that made it the best card in the game, which it certainly isn't. So when you can make it a 5/24, that is good. Obviously, that needs a little bit more reliability. You typically need a Carnage and Venom in hand that you didn't play earlier, and they probably would have been better earlier, to where maybe the 5/24 is still winning, but just like there's too many variables, I think, to make that always the constant play. So I kept it as 5/12 with that in mind. It is a little bit below stat line, which is how I feel about this card. I think that's accurate. Nova is a 1/1, but if you destroy it, you give 1 power to all other cards. Optimistically, we could say we gave 1 to every other card on our side of the board. Maybe we Killmongered it late and we got 11 power from it. There's a little bit of variability to it, but it's just a 1 cost, so it's not that big of a deal. It does require something to kill it, so that's an extra turn, and it does require that card to be played, whether we want to play it or not. But with all that in mind, it is slightly above stat line. Nova, I think, is still good. If anyone remembers their super early beta days, Nova was the best card in the game because it gave 2 power to everything. But even at 1, it gets slept on a little bit, but it's still good. Okoye is a 2/2. It's sort of the inverse of Nakia, where it gives +1 to all of the cards in deck. Obviously, the earlier you play it, the better. That's why I put it as it does have some RNG. This card isn't good if you play it on turn 5 or 6, or obviously at the very end. It's sort of a dead draw. And because of that, it ends up sort of being a 5/5 if optimistically we play each card that we're drawing in sequence after the fact. So it tends to be just on stat line. Omega Red, another sort of Mr. Fantastic, Miss Marvel variant. They changed it and made it much better, in my opinion. As long as you're winning your location, you get +3 to all locations. It doesn't have to be adjacent. That's something unique that Omega Red has rather than Miss Marvel and Mr. Fantastic. I think that it is good, but it does have some variability. It is sometimes hard to make sure that the location where this is at is winning. It also invites sort of competition, especially late in the game where it's usually possible for your opponent to beat you if they want to and have the means to. So with that in mind, it does sort of fall to a 4-7, despite it feeling better than it is. Below stat line. Orca is a 6-11, but if it's by itself, it's a 6-16. It does require some turns to set up appropriately. You have to keep avoiding that location. Earlier I said Marvel Snap sometimes feels like a two location game rather than a 3 location game, but you typically start working on that 3rd location late game, so now you choose not to a little bit so that you can play this on the big play. Orca is also really, really good if you know how to bait Galactus. If you are playing a Galactus deck and it looks like you're going to do a Galactus deck and then they rush over to make sure that you can't do Galactus and instead you do Orca, that's its actual best purpose that I find playing with it. And because of that, it does tend to be a little bit better than other 6-cost cards. It's above stat line. Next up is Patriot. Patriot gives +2 power to any cards that don't have effects. This is really good early series, especially when you don't have high evolutionary and you do want to play cards like Abomination and Hulk without the discounts or without the extra power. Typically, though, Patriot has still found its home as an Ultron deck, and it does tend to get off at least 8 cards with extra power if you're playing a Patriot full-on deck. To me, that does mean that you're using all your turns to sort of set it up. If you don't get Patriot off, it feels like a dud, so I took away 6 points for that. There's also some variability on how much power it's going to get. And with all that said, it stands as a normal 3-cost card. Punisher is a 3-3. This card's been tweaked a lot in OTAs. Marvel Snap's trying to get it just right. Unfortunately, it is still just shy. If everything goes according to plan, it's a 3-7. It is a little bit of a disruptor, but because the variability, a part of the equation, ends up being a 3-6. If this was a 3-4, that would be just right. That's what Marvel Snap needs to do. Make this a 3-4. Till then, just below stat line. Red Hulk is next up. It is a 6-9. I feel as though it is very reliable that your opponent will not optimize their turns at least once, and you can have a pretty reliable 6-13. Some people think that that was not the case, and it's not worth the risk. I think it's up to you whether or not you want to take that risk. I find that it's very reliable that this is a 6-13, if not higher, to where, to me, it is a pretty good 6-cost card. It's just the right thing that you want to plug and play as a 6-cost. Red Skull is a 5-14, but it gives every card on your opponent's side in this location 2 power, to where really it tends to be, let's see, a 5-8. Is that right? 4 plus another 4. Wait, 2, 4, 6, 8. 14 minus 8. Oh, man. Math on live is rough, but it's not as good as reported. I'm just going to put the -5. It's like the variability. Usually you're not playing this in a completely dead location. Red Skull is a bad card. Only usually works in Sauron decks. I don't think Sauron decks are good. Hot garbage. Rescue is a 4-4. A lot of people think that Rescue is just like Jessica Jones. It's a 4-4. As long as you play a card here next, it's a 4-9. The difference is it's very easy to dodge a location. It's very restricting to play on that location again. Especially, it's really bad to tell your opponent where you're going to be playing next turn. And that's why Rescue is hot garbage. One of the worst cards in the game. Oh, I put it just below stat line. Rescue is one of hard garbage. Rocket Raccoon. Make predictions if you think Rocket Raccoon is more like Drax or more like Gamora. If you bet Gamora, you're correct. Rocket Raccoon is a pretty reliable 1-5. The difference is Rocket Raccoon is easy to play at the end. Similar to Ant-Man, I think that a lot of players make mistakes at rushing out their 1-cost early game, to where if you're synergizing well and you have a really good 5-cost card that you can attach to the 1-cost card, or maybe if you're working within a 7-turn game thanks to Magic or Limbo, it's really easy to throw this out late when you do know what your opponent is going to do without too much detriment. The problem with Drax and Groot is that cost is just really hard to balance late game. That you typically want to play it right when you can, and it's a hard guessing game. Rocket Raccoon, on the other hand, has a little bit more flexibility in terms of when you can play it, and so not only is it above stat line, I genuinely think it's an S tier card. It's one of the better 1-costs that you can drop, just like Ant-Man and Martyr. It's a 1-5. Even though I said 4, I still think it's good enough to be a 1-5. Sage is a 3-0, but when you play it, you get +2 power for each different cost that's at that location. Optimistically, you're getting at least 14 power out of it, although obviously lots of people have seen this comboed thanks to like Wong and Odin. getting it even more power to where 14 does feel sometimes kind of low. The variability is there, -3, but honestly, it tends to get this pretty reliably. It does take a little bit of setup with you intentionally making sure that your costs are correct to where this is one of the best 3-cost cards in the game. Tempted to say S tier. I think it's going to get nerfed soon, so I'm just going to say above stat line. Ronan the Accuser. Nope. Sasquatch. Sasquatch is a 6/10 that gets cheaper based on how many cards you played the previous turn. That means that it's theoretically possible to get this down to 0. We've had cards like this before, like High Evolutionary Abomination, to where that makes this card better and better the cheaper that you can get it. It does take a turn of setup, obviously, before you can play it the next turn, but even with that in the math, it is a 6/14, which makes it above stat line. Ronan the Accuser. Nope. Sage. I did Sage. Uh-oh. Ronan the Accuser. Excuse me as I fiddle with my Excel sheet. Ronan the Accuser. 5/5. Gets +2 points for every card in your opponent's hand. It does tend to cause disruption, though this isn't the disruption card itself. There's a lot of variability in how much is going to stay in your opponent's hand. It does require certain things to happen to make this card worth it. With all that said, it's pretty hot garbage. Not good to play. Sebastian Shaw, 3/4. Ideally, you want to trigger this at least twice to get it to a 3/16. Obviously, that there's some variability. It does require certain cards to be played in a certain order. I don't think Sebastian Shaw is as good as reported. You've probably realized that too. You don't see it that often. It's pretty much only in Silver Surfer decks, though it seems on surface to be better across the board. It just isn't. And I think, again, this is where the formula proves itself, that it's like, this card feels good, but it just isn't played. And it's because of subtle things like that. There's just too much variability and it requires too much setup to actually get it to where you want it. If maybe, well, actually, yeah, if our expectations were more realistic and it was like a 3/8, it would still be bad. It still requires just a little bit too much setup. It becomes basically a Dakin, and Dakin's hot garbage. Sebastian Shaw is hot garbage. Sentry is a 4/8, and it summons a clone of itself as a -8. Usually this is in a deck that can deal with that -8 to where I don't really feel like that -8 is a problem. Maybe you get stuck with it, so I went ahead and gave it the CV of -4. It's possible you get stuck with that -8. You don't draw the cards you need. Maybe something happened like a Cosmo, I guess. But though I'm not really trying to keep that in mind, I feel like this is even better than what I'm putting in the formula. But I'm going to say it's above stat line. I don't feel like it's S tier, but it's definitely better than other forecasts. The formula feels correct in this case. Century is a 4/8, but I personally put it at S tier. Cersei, when you play it, it changes all of your cards and it transforms them into a new card that costs 1 more than it originally was. I feel like it's totally fair to assume that you're going to get at least 3 plus power on your value, especially if you intentionally played sort of like lower cards. You'll probably get at least, you're hoping for 3 better cards. There's some variability there, but I feel like if you balance all that out, it ends up staying as a 11, which is exactly what we want it as. It is a good card. She-Hulk 6/10, another one of my personal favorites. This helped me get to even like the top 30,000 when I was first getting back into it. She-Hulk works like a lot of other cards we talked about, to where it does get cheaper and you could theoretically even make it a 0. It does take some setup, but it can be a 6/14 and it belongs in the above stat line. Shuri is a 4/1. We talked about this way at the beginning of the video, that Shuri was a complicated mistress in terms of how do we apply the power that she creates to its value, and like how many turns does it take to set up? Does it end up actually being worth it? I don't think it does. I think Shuri is a trap, not only in terms of like how much you're actually investing to get the high power card, but you're also just giving so much information to your opponent. Similar to the reason why Rescue is bad, Shuri baits that you're going to play their next turn. You invite your opponent to do things with that information. You also just telegraph future information. If you're making a high cost card here and you need high cost elsewhere, then you must have something up your sleeve to move it, whether it's a Zola or a Taskmaster, and your opponent can plan off that. Shuri just gives so much information that it's absolutely not worth anything that it does. Shuri is one of my absolute like top contenders for hot garbage. It is a trap. More players need to realize that Shuri is bad. Do not play Shuri if you're trying to climb the ladder. Silk is a 2/5, but every time a card is played on either side of the location, it moves, so there's a little bit of RNG to it. However, as I've played more and more, I used to think this card was bad too, but again, as my mindset sort of changed, I've realized that you can sort of control where this card goes. It's not as random as advertised. I think this is exactly what you want as a 2-cost card. If you get better and better, this stays as a true 2/5, exactly what you want it to be. Silver Surfer is a 3/2. Silver Surfer obviously created its own meta. Typically, you are trying to get pretty much your whole board, if not just a few cards less, that extra 2 power. Typically, it's comboed with like a Wong or an Odin or a Absorbing Man, to where you're even doing it twice, and it's all thanks to this card. It created its own meta. There's hardly any real variability. I put it there because I put it there for everything that is technically variable, but it's really reliable. It does deserve a -6 cost, though, in the turns department, because you are building everything around it. But even then, it stays far above its stat line. Silver Surfer is an S tier card, top of its class in the 3s. Scar, 6/11. For every card that you play that's 10 or higher, it gets cheaper. Theoretically, it could go down to a 6/0. It's not quite as good and easy to play as Sasquatch and She-Hulk, and that's why it's just on stat line. The feasibility of it is a little bit harder. And the power that you have to play to get it to work is a little bit higher than the other two require. Spectrum. Spectrum is the biggest surprise to me when it comes to this formula. I thought Blue Marvel was really surprising. Iron Man was surprising and based on how it works, but I still fully believe in this formula. I played a lot with Spectrum. Spectrum does always do big things that I don't even really expect it to do. But I feel like if you build a deck around Spectrum and everything's ongoing and you play it last, it is a 6/6. It makes it 24. Obviously, there's some variability to it, and it makes it an 18. The big problem with Spectrum that I can't account for on the formula is that Spectrum replaces Onslaught, right? Onslaught typically creates more fantastical things than Spectrum does. But if I'm just looking at it as a card on its own and I need it to create 24 power, Spectrum does that. And in terms of the formula, it is surprisingly probably one of the better S tier cards. I think Onslaught also deserves to be up there. Onslaught I don't think is necessarily a power card. It's more of a chain reaction card to me. But I don't have Onslaught on here. You could put her right next to Spectrum. I think in theory you could do either two. If you have something that cheats them out, or a magic situation or a limbo situation, you are almost always winning, I think. So Spectrum, S tier card. I'm a little bit surprised. I would have bet that it was on stat, but S tier. Spider-Woman, 5/8. I think you should think of it as a 5/12 optimistically. Hopefully you're taking away 4 power from your opponent. There's variability to that. It is disruption. I would like it to be better. It will probably be changed one day since all Spider-Man cards are move themed except for this one. But as it stands, just below stat line. Star-Lord. Star-Lord's hot garbage. We've already talked about the Guardians a bit, and we know why, so we'll just throw it in there. Stature is a 5/7. Similar to Miles Morales, though, we should think of this as a 1/7. It does take a few things to set it up properly, but it does stay a little bit above stat line, and it should belong right next to Miles Morales in terms of similar, kind of one cost, but not quite one cost cards. Swordmaster. Swordmaster does have a little bit of a weird RNG element. You are choosing to just sacrifice a card. Hopefully you get lucky, maybe you don't. I didn't really put the RNG up to it. I think you kind of just assume the worst of Swordmaster. You're not assuming the best with it. And so really it's not RNG then if you just correctly assume the worst. And so it's just a 3/7 right where it should be. To me, it's a non-stat line card. If you're willing to just lose a card with Swordmaster, maybe create some favorable RNG with like Ghost Rider. Swordmaster is really good. I think it deserves more credit than it gets. Taskmaster. Taskmaster is good. But the problem is, and the formula doesn't necessarily account for this, it's usually paired up with things like Shuri. And that's a bad combination. Taskmaster I haven't seen really stand on its own. It does require 2 turns no matter how you slice it. You have to play the big thing, and then there is variability on what it gets and if it goes off appropriately. Obviously, if like the thing gets Shang-Chi'd before you play it, you lose your 5/0 and wasted your turn, both 4 and 5. I think Taskmaster creates a lot of traps for you in the same way that Shuri does. Taskmaster, hot garbage. Thanos. Thanos has changed a lot, especially in recent OTAs and patches, to where Thanos really is just trying to make itself powerful now rather than things around it. I think because of that, it's become worse. I think it's just an on-stat line card. I Athena is a 2/1. As long as you play 2 cards each turn, it will go up in 3 power. It seems like a hard thing to do on paper. It actually ends up being a pretty feasible thing to do. I put 5 on the turns though because you are, intentionally doing something that could otherwise be a hindrance, and it is just for Athena usually, unless you have some other things going on like Angela. But it's pretty good. I would say above stat line, Athena was a good 2-cost card to grab. Thor is a 3/4. It shuffles Mjolnir into your deck, and if you summon it, it doubles Thor's power. It does not double its power. It gives Thor 6 power. I was thinking of Beta Ray Bill for a second. So it effectively becomes a 3/10. The big thing here is that you lose a draw, and that's just too big of a deal for me. I don't like that you lose a draw. You're hoping that you get Jane Foster to get that 0 out for you early. In those cases, it is a very good 3/10 card. It deserves to be as above stat line, but more often than not, it is not doing that. It's a shame to lose a draw. There's better things you could be doing. Thor, to me, is hot garbage. Tatiana is a 1/5. It does have a little bit of variability to it. There's no guarantee it will stay on your side. I do like the tactics where people use this card as sort of disruption. And so I'm torn whether I want to put in best in class or above stat line. I don't think you can have 4 1-cost cards in best in class. There's already 4. So I'm going to put this above stat line, and I'm going to move Rocket down from earlier. And they're both best stat line. I think Deadpool, Ant-Man, and Martyr are the only true S tier ones, and the others are A tier ones. Yeah. I'm going to change that as a last minute revision. Okay, Typhoid Mary, 4/10. But every other card gets -1. That really should be a part of the power. I just kept it simple as a -2 disruption. It could obviously be like a Sauron tactic. Typically, you want to do something else to remedy the harm that you're causing to yourself. So really, it does need to be like a 2/2 on both sides. This ends up being a 4/6. I don't hate Typhoid Mary, but I think she does belong in the hot garbage. Ultron, 6/8. I'm going to assume that you get at least 4 drones off, which are each 2 power, which would make this effectively a 6/16. That's pretty good power. It does take a little bit of setup, I feel like. You don't usually just play the Ultron by itself. You usually have it paired up with a Patriot or a Blue Marvel, something that's giving those drones some power. Really, though, if you don't do that and you're comfortable with just the 2/2s, if you can somehow win a location with just 8, I do think this might even contend for S tier, but for now, we'll keep it in above stat line. I do think it typically needs that pair card to feel super good about playing Ultron. Warpath. Warpath is a 4/10 now, I believe. 4/10. But you're restricting yourself. You're closing off a whole location, and it takes some turns to make sure that you're doing that appropriately. This ends up being, to me, a 4/6. It's hot garbage. Warpath, not good. Don't do that to yourself. Werewolf, 3/1, but every time you play an on-reveal card, it moves and gains 2 power. I've seen Werewolf realistically get triggered like 5 to 6 times, so I feel like a 3/13 is totally fair. Obviously, there's some variability. Obviously, it takes some certain turns to trigger this appropriately. Most of the time, you're going to play those cards anyway, but the style in which you play them, I feel like means it should have at least a 2 in the turns category, but it still stays pretty good. I think it's above stat line. A lot of people think that it's still an S tier card. I don't think that. I think it's great, but not perfect. Wolfsbane. Wolfsbane's really only good in weird Wong Silver Surfer metas. It's very meta specific. Typically, it's only a 3/8. There's some variability if you get it off in the right way. Usually, you want to save it for last, and it's just not powerful enough to be a good last card. I think it's really good in early series, which is why I'm going to keep it as just below stat line instead of hot garbage. Good for early series, really bad when you're doing stuff. So that is everything that I have for today's video. Just to kind of sort of recap everything. This is about half the cards that are currently out in Marvel Snap. These are typically the cards that we associate with giving power. Maybe there's 1 or 2 others we could add. We talked about maybe adding Onslaught, Nexus, Spectrum. But for the most part, this is every card that gives power. And this is how you should look at them, in my opinion. This is coming from me, someone who has reached sort of the top 1% of the game. I think some of these realizations really help me get to the top level. So if you're looking to climb, I heavily consider starting to reconsider some of these cards like this. I just want to touch on maybe 4 real quick, one last time. Mojo, to me, is the best card in the game. That's a 2/8. Ant-Man and Rocket and Martyr They seem like they have downsides. If you play them late, they usually have decent upside and are pretty reliable 1/5s. That's really great power for late game, especially if you're pairing it with like a 5 cost. Some surprise bad cards were Blue Marvel. What else was in the bad section? Blue Marvel is surprisingly bad. Mr. Fantastic, I think, is surprisingly bad. Was there really big? I think the Guardians, aside from Gamora and Rocket, are really bad. Things that you should feel a little bit more comfortable with is like Swordmaster. I'll definitely link this in the video so you can look at it a little bit more. But main takeaway, some of these cards aren't just bad RNG. They're kind of skill level. And I think you should look at them this way. These are just the things that I felt like sharing and help me get to a higher level. So if you enjoyed this, please consider leaving like a like and subscribe. You can check out this channel as a whole. We have a lot of variety content that we're doing. We're so back. We're so back this year. So you should totally check out some other things that we're doing. If you like Dimension 20 at all, we are going to cover all the Never Stop Blowing Up episodes that come out. And that's sort of our other ongoing series going on right now. But if you would like more Marvel Snap content, let me know. Leave some comments. I'll probably upload at least one more video breaking down some other things I've learned on this journey to the top of the ladder. Yeah, and thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.